talk us through the worst case scenario here.
How bad can this get?
What if the woman who has survived every impossible mission the Lioness program has thrown at her for 3 seasons is finally about to run out of luck, and the show is warning us about it before it even happens? That is the question hanging over everything right now, because Lioness Season 3 has spent 4 episodes slowly tightening a noose around Joe McNamara, and the official preview for Episode 5, titled The Idiot Army, promises the moment where that noose either gets pulled tight or gets cut loose for good. Before we get into what this episode could mean for Joe, for Kaitlyn, and for the fractures forming in Joe's marriage, let's quickly rebuild the picture of where Season 3 has taken us, because everything about Episode 5 only lands if you remember exactly how much pressure has been building underneath this season. Season 3 opened with a covert strike that was supposed to be clean, the kind of operation Joe and her team have run 100 times before, except this one unearths something nobody expected. A hidden threat that pulls Joe into a chain of events far bigger than the mission itself. From the very first episode, the show signals that this season is not just another self-contained hunt for a single target. Instead, it is building towards something systemic, a network rather than a person, which immediately raises the stakes because networks are harder to kill than individuals, and the people running them are almost never in the room when the shooting starts. By Episode 2, that pressure had already spread beyond the battlefield and into Washington, with Kaitlyn racing to contain a crisis that is spiraling across multiple agencies at once. That detail matters enormously going into Episode 5, because it tells us Kaitlyn is not simply managing Joe's missions from behind a desk this season, she is fighting a political and bureaucratic war in parallel, one where the threat is not bullets but blame, leaks, and turf battles between agencies that do not trust each other. At the same time, back home, Neal is shown trying to steady rising fear, which is the show's way of quietly reminding us that Joe's family life is not a subplot happening off to the side. It is a ticking clock running in the background of every single mission she takes. Episode 3, called The Bear is Infected, escalates things further. Joe confronts a breach, and the team is forced into a genuinely risky play just to root out infiltrators who have already gotten inside their own operation. This is a crucial turning point because it establishes that the enemy this season is not simply operating outside the perimeter, they have already compromised something on the inside. Once a show tells you the walls have already been breached, every scene afterward carries a different kind of tension, because you start watching every character's loyalty a little more carefully, wondering who might be feeding information to the other side without even realizing it. Episode 4 pushes the frantic energy even higher. A hunt is launched and the team is racing against time. While at home, Neal's fears are no longer just rising, they are becoming something the marriage may not be able to absorb. This is the episode where the emotional through line of the season fully catches up to the operational one. Joe is fighting a war she cannot talk about with the one person she comes home to, and Neal is left trying to hold together a version of normal life that keeps getting quietly hollowed out every time Joe walks back through the door changed by what she has seen and done. When a show spends 4 straight episodes escalating both an external hunt and an internal domestic strain at the same time, it is almost always building toward a moment where those two pressures collide. And that collision point is exactly what Episode 5 appears to be setting up. Which brings us to the Idiot Army. According to the official rundown, Joe leads the hunt as her team exposes a hidden network operating through covert handlers, while Kaitlyn and Westfield hustle to assess the threat. On the surface, that description sounds like forward momentum, the good guys finally landing a real blow against the network that has been shadowing the entire season. But look closer at the specific language being used. A hidden network operating through covert handlers is a very different kind of enemy than a single cell or a lone financier. Handlers imply layers, meaning the people Joe's team encounters directly are almost certainly not the real architects of the threat. They are intermediaries, disposable pieces positioned specifically to absorb damage and protect whoever is actually pulling the strings. If Joe's team exposes this network by taking out or capturing handlers, the show may be setting up a classic Taylor Sheridan misdirection, where a hard-won tactical victory in episode 5 turns out to be a strategic trap once the season reaches its final stretch, because the real enemy was never in the room to begin with. Now let's talk about the part of this preview generating the most conversation, the idea that this episode brings us dangerously close to losing Joe. It is worth being upfront that no release trailer or official material has explicitly confirmed Joe's death in episode 5. What we do have is a mounting pattern of narrative choices that make her vulnerability feel more real than at almost any point in the show's run. 3 seasons in, Joe has become the emotional and tactical center of this entire universe, and shows built around a signature lead character rarely kill that character off in a mid-season episode with a title as understated as the Idiot Army. Big character deaths tend to be reserved for season finales, where the emotional weight can be given room to breathe and the fallout can be explored over multiple future episodes rather than rushed into the next week's cold open. That said, the specific mechanics of this episode do raise real danger. A hidden network operating through covert handlers means Joe is walking directly into a situation designed by people who have had time to prepare, to anticipate a response, and possibly to set a trap disguised as an opportunity. The phrase Kaitlyn and Westfield hustled to assess the threat is doing a lot of quiet work here too, because hustle implies they are behind, reacting rather than directing, which is the opposite of the control Kaitlyn usually tries to maintain over Joe's operations. If the 2 people responsible for reading intelligence and guiding Joe's moves are scrambling to catch up in real time, that strongly suggests Joe ends up in the field with less oversight and less certainty about what she is actually walking into than usual. In a season that has already shown us an infiltrated operation and rising external chaos, that combination is exactly the kind of setup a show uses to put its lead character in the most exposed position she has faced all year, even if the show ultimately chooses to have her survive it. So what could Joe's next plan look like coming out of this, assuming she survives the events of episode 5? Given everything Kaitlyn has been dealing with across the season, from agency-spanning crises in episode 2 to scrambling reactively in episode 5 itself, it would make sense for Kaitlyn's next move to be less about running damage control and more about going on the offensive politically. If her team has just exposed a network of covert handlers, that gives her leverage, names, connections, and intelligence she did not have before, and characters like Kaitlyn tend to use exactly that kind of leverage to reshape the chessboard rather than simply reporting up the chain. Expect Kaitlyn's next plan to involve using whatever Joe's team pulls out of this operation to pressure whoever has been protecting this network from the shadows, possibly forcing a confrontation with someone inside the agency structure itself, given how strongly this season has hinted that the real threat has already breached the inside. Then there is the breakup storyline, which by this point in the season has been building with an almost unbearable inevitability. Neal's fear has moved from an undertone in episode 1 to something the show is directly naming as struggle by episode 4, and marriages in this kind of show rarely recover once that language starts being used on screen. It would not be surprising if episode 5, coming right on the heels of Joe walking into her most exposed operation yet, is also the episode where something breaks permanently at home. Whether that is Neal finally confronting Joe about what her work is doing to their family, or Joe herself making a choice in the field that she cannot come home and explain, creating a distance that the marriage cannot close. The tragedy the show seems to be building toward is not necessarily that Joe dies, it is that surviving this life might cost her everything that made surviving worth it in the first place. Looking ahead to what's next after this episode, the pieces on the board suggest a final stretch of the season built around consequences rather than new mysteries. The network has apparently been exposed, which means the back half of the season likely shifts from discovery to confrontation, forcing Joe's team to deal with whoever was actually controlling those covert handlers all along. At home, whatever happens between Joe and Neal in this episode will almost certainly define the emotional stakes for the remaining episodes, because a show this deliberate about pairing operational danger with domestic strain is not going to let that thread simply fade into the background. And for Kaitlyn, the political fallout from a crisis that has already been described as spiraling across agencies means her arc is likely heading toward a much bigger institutional confrontation, One where the question is not just whether Joe's team can win in the field, but whether Kaitlyn can protect that victory once it reaches Washington. All of this is why the Idiot Army feels like one of the most important episodes of the season so far, not because it necessarily delivers the death of a lead character, but because it is positioned as the moment where every pressure this season has been building. The infiltrated operation, the political spiral, the fear at home, and the hidden network of handlers finally converges on Joe at once. Whether she walks out of this episode a little more scarred or genuinely changed forever, the show has spent 4 episodes making sure that whatever happens here will not just affect the mission, it will affect everything Joe has left to fight for. Let's also talk about why the title itself, The Idiot Army, is worth sitting with for a moment, because Sheridan-produced shows rarely choose episode titles casually. The phrase carries a tone of contempt, the kind of thing a hardened operator might mutter about an enemy they consider disorganized, overconfident, or expendable. If that title is meant to describe the covert handlers Joe's team is hunting, it suggests the show wants us to underestimate this network right alongside the characters, only to reveal later that underestimating them was exactly the mistake that got someone hurt. Alternatively, the title could be a piece of dark irony aimed inward, describing Joe's own team or the wider intelligence apparatus itself. A suggestion that despite all their training and resources, the people meant to protect Joe are stumbling through this operation with far less certainty than their reputation suggests. Either reading supports the same idea, that episode 5 is built around the gap between how prepared everyone believes they are and how exposed they actually turn out to be. It is also worth bringing the rest of the team into this conversation, because a season this focused on infiltration and hidden networks rarely limits the fallout to just Joe, Kaitlyn, and Neal. Cruz, Grady, and the newer additions to the Lioness roster this season have all been positioned in ways that suggest their loyalty and reliability could become question marks once the team starts exposing handlers connected to the wider network. Remember that episode 3 already established a breach on the inside. If that breach was never fully resolved and there is no indication in the official synopses that it was, then episode 5's confrontation with covert handlers could easily double as the episode where the show reveals just how deep that earlier infiltration actually went. It would be a very Sheridan move to let the audience believe the internal threat from episode 3 was handled, only to bring it roaring back at the exact moment the team is most exposed in the field. Westfield's role in this episode also deserves attention, because he is specifically named alongside Kaitlyn as someone hustling to assess the threat rather than directing it from a position of strength. Across the first 2 seasons, Westfield has typically operated as the steady institutional hand, the one making sure operations stay within the lines Washington is willing to tolerate. If episode 5 puts him in a reactive posture instead, that is a meaningful shift, because it suggests the threat this week has outpaced even the people whose entire job is staying ahead of exactly this kind of danger. When the institutional safety net starts scrambling instead of steering, that is usually the show's way of telling its audience that whatever happens to Joe in the field this week, nobody is coming to save her in time if things go wrong. Now, stepping back to the marriage storyline for a moment, because it deserves more than a single paragraph, given how carefully the show has been building it. Neal's fear in episode 2 read as a spouse's ordinary anxiety about a partner in a dangerous job. By episode 4, the show upgraded that fear into an active struggle, language that implies Neal is not simply worried anymore, he is actively fighting something, whether that is his own mental state, a marriage that feels like it is slipping away, or a growing suspicion about what Joe's job is actually doing to her. The distinction between worry and struggle is not accidental in a script this deliberately paced, and it strongly suggests that whatever storyline the writers are building toward involves Neal reaching some kind of breaking point, rather than simply enduring in silence the way spouses in these stories often do in earlier seasons. If episode 5 is the episode where Joe is at her most exposed professionally, there is a strong emotional logic to it also being the episode where her home life reaches its breaking point, because the show has spent 4 episodes deliberately building these 2 pressures on parallel tracks. A breakup unfolding in the same episode where Joe is walking into her most dangerous operation of the season would not be a coincidence. It would be the entire point. It would frame Joe's professional victory, if she gets one, as hollow, a win that costs her the one thing her job was supposedly protecting in the first place. That is the kind of gut punch structure this franchise has used before, and everything about this season's pacing suggests it is exactly where things are headed. Let's also address the audience theories circulating around this episode directly, because a lot of viewers have been asking whether the title of this video, referencing Joe's death, means the show has already confirmed it somewhere. To be clear, based on everything available right now, there is no official confirmation of Joe's death in episode 5. What we do have is a synopsis and a pattern of escalating danger that makes her vulnerability feel more plausible than it has all series, combined with a title and character positioning that suggests the safety net around her is thinner this week than ever before. Whether that vulnerability turns into an actual death, a near-death experience that reshapes her character going forward, or simply the closest call of her career so far, is something only the episode itself can answer. What matters for us as an audience is recognizing exactly why the show has built this level of tension around her, because understanding that groundwork is what makes watching episode 5 so much more rewarding. Putting all of this together, episode 5 looks less like a standalone hunt for a hidden network and more like the moment where every thread this season has been quietly pulling finally tightens around Joe all at once. The operational risk from an enemy hiding behind covert handlers, the political scramble happening around Kaitlyn and Westfield, the unresolved question of exactly how deep the internal breach from episode 3 actually goes, and the personal collapse building at home with Neal are all converging in a single hour of television. That is precisely why the tension around this episode feels different from anything the show has done before, because for the first time this season, there is no separation left between Joe's professional world and her personal one. Whatever happens in the Idiot Army, it is going to hit both at the exact same time.